Alrighty, we're going to get started for today. A couple of reminders. I've previously already talked about the self-introduction activity. This is due on Wednesday, so that will be this coming Wednesday. Answer those questions about yourself. It's worth 10 points. Something I haven't introduced that is available on Blackboard now is your research article report. I'm obviously telling you this with quite a bit of time because it's not due till the end of February, but if you are wanting to spend the time doing that assignment early, whatever that looks like for you, I wanted to make sure you have that available with the resources. So for that assignment, you need to find a peer-reviewed research article. Now, next class, I'll be talking about what peer-reviewed research is, why it matters, things like that. I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about how to find it. I will mention a couple of sources, but if you need help finding papers, let me know. Generally, good places would be Google Scholar, and then Fort Hays's database is a great place to search for papers. But again, if you need help, there's extra time for you to do that. This assignment is just a one-page double-spaced paper, so it's honestly pretty short, 30 points here. This is a screenshot from what that assignment outline looks like, and this is on Blackboard right now. So you can kind of see I'm asking you to describe the findings of the research and then to talk about why it's important, who benefits. You also have to include an APA citation. I'm going to talk about how to do that today in class. It is important to get full points on this, that you answer all of the questions. If you only answer part of the questions, you will only get part of the points. So do make sure you look at this before submitting your paper. I do have a rubric on that assignment as well, and I put this little star here on the citation because I am going to talk about this today just for a bit, and I'm going to have you all practice because I'll ask you to cite your sources occasionally in here. Typically, y'all will be citing and sourcing peer-reviewed articles. So most of the time, those will be online. Back in the day, there used to be a big kind of collection of those types of papers in libraries that were printed out, but most folks don't really access those that way anymore. The big difference there is just the need to include a DOI, which is bold on this slide here. So the DOI is associated with the article, and typically you put that HTTP or that will show up on the journal article if you're accessing it online. So that would be kind of like a difference here. Generally, you're going to abbreviate the author's first name and middle initial if that's present. So I gave you an example of myself. So if you were citing a paper, for example, you would say N.K. and then Lazarus is my last name. You would spell that out all the way. So when you're looking at these titles, sometimes it's kind of hard to tell what's going on, but this is the author's last name spelled out and then the first name is abbreviated. This is kind of just a standard outline of what an APA citation looks like. And I do have this PowerPoint posted on Blackboard, so you can refer back to this as we kind of move forward in the class. I do also have sources linked for reading over more details if you would like on this PowerPoint. So we are going to practice. I'm going to have y'all practice this. I want you to use this paper to cite it. So the information that you would need is actually mostly on this page right here, but I've also posted this link to the paper on Blackboard. So go pull that up, and I want you to actually write out the physical citation. So whatever is more helpful, I can go here. That might be the most helpful piece of information for you to look at while you kind of do this. And you are free to work with someone if you'd like. So go pull up that article, and I want you to practice citing it by hand, which is kind of annoying sometimes, but it shouldn't take you too long. And if you have questions or you need help, just let me know. If you go to the announcements section on Blackboard, that's where this article is linked. So go click the announcement for today. And I have this paper linked. You don't have to turn this into me, so you can type it on your computer if that's helpful. One other thing that you might have noticed that's kind of funky about this paper, we have these authorships from entire classes that are in here. So we have Cambridge Ringe Latin 2017 biology class, and then this Mass Commnet 2017 biotechnology class. Those would just be spelled out all the way. You're not going to abbreviate those. So for your reference. That is kind of unusual. Yep, you have to write out all the names. So you write out the last name and then abbreviate the first initial. Yep. Mhm. Not letting you sign in to like Blackboard, you mean? Mm-hmm. Touch ID. Do you have Touch ID, Hick?
Yeah, but I can't even really do it.
Use a phone, tablet, or
hit that,
security
and
key.
then
Do you have your Duo up?
this is what I've done every time, and this never popped up before.
Do you have the Duo app, or is this like an Apple security system?
I have no idea. I've never had to do this.
Hmm. All the steps on your device. So you do have the Duo app though, right?
No.
That is something you're going to need. I'm surprised you haven't had to do that yet. I don't know. Are you on Safari or Chrome or
Chrome.
login canceled? Hit that other options button down there. IT help desk. Oh, go back to the other options. The one that says manage device, touch ID,
It'll just open the same thing.
bypass code.
So
Well, go possibly search FHSU login Duo because that is like the administrative one that they'd be able to help you with. Duo is managed by the university. So I'd search that like in a web browser and see if it pulls up how you could like link those things together. You don't necessarily need it. For today, I can go back to the picture of the article if that's helpful. Go to the announcements and then click that link. And then that's the link. Mhm. Got it? Not yet.
because I looked at the answer.
Makes sense. And here you're noticing those dots. Did you pull this from Google Scholar? So I want you to practice doing it by hand because these dots, that means they're clipping out authors. So you'll notice when you read that author list, if you go back to your citation, there's only, go back to the thing you had typed out. So do you see there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 shown there? If you go back to the paper, there's more than that are listed. So hit show all. So those are all the authors. So you would need to manually incorporate those in a true citation. Did you get your citations?
Yeah.
Get your citations?
Well, I will.
Working on it? Did anything pull up for you with that?
Try to open on here. It's open the same thing.
Manage Duo account. You type stuff in there.
Anyway, just opened up another this again. I signed in. So
When you signed in on that page.
I just opened it again.
Honestly, this is going to be something you're going to have to talk to Tiger Tech about.
Yep.
Because they manage that multiple site. Okay, we'll spend about 1 more minute here and then we're going to kind of move on. Okay, we are going to get going with kind of the rest of what we're doing for today. I do, as some of you have noticed, I do have the answer on Blackboard, so feel free to kind of compare this to what you had written down. Some things you might be noticing about this answer. This paper does have page numbers listed. I have included those here. You don't technically have to have those. So if you don't have page numbers, that's okay. One thing that is both annoying and important to kind of make sure you're doing when you're citing sources is including all the authors. Most citation generators on like Google Scholar or other types of websites will abbreviate some of the authors by putting a ... And that means they're basically just clipping them out. You do actually have to physically write out all authors up to 20. So this is something that I'm going to ask you to kind of incorporate as we move forward. So that's why I'm having you practice now. If you have questions or you need more help on this, just let me know. These are those resources I said I would provide to you. So again, these are on the PowerPoint. You can follow these links and use them as you would like. Today, we're going to be talking about characteristics of life, which I'll admit is a relatively simple topic. This is kind of a really broad streak. This is a huge overview for a lot of different topics in the course, but it is important. It's basically how biologists define life and why we do that. I've linked an interesting article about banana genetics because I have kind of an aside about them as we move forward. If you're wanting to read along in the textbook, you're free to, but you do not have to. We're in chapter 1. And I am going to ask today that you log into Socrative. Again, Lazarus 5825 is the room. I'm honestly just going to write that on the board right now so that we can keep going here. So. Okay. Get to this sometime ideally before the next couple of hours, but log in here for your attendance. Learning objectives for today, not very many of them, and again, they are relatively simple. I want you to know the characteristics of life. So how does a biologist define when something is alive? Be able to distinguish between non-living and living things, and then we might talk about why biologists would care about these designations. Looking really broadly here to start, within the world of all living organisms, there's 3 domains of life. Now I have them featured up here. They're bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. And domains are the broadest possible grouping of organisms. Typically, organisms within these groups are going to be placed together based on similarities and evolutionary relationships to each other. And bacteria and archaea tend to be small, single-celled organisms. Eukarya is a broad group in which we belong. Other things like fungi, protists, and plants are also eukaryotes. We'll be talking about specific cellular structures that distinguish these types of groups, but in general, this is our broadest classification of living organisms. Now, there's a huge diversity within all of these things that we consider to be alive. Diversity essentially refers to the number of different organisms and different types of organisms that exist on the planet. Now, the left figure here is kind of an early model tree of life, which is really highlighting eukaryotic organisms. If we read some of these branch titles, they're things like Plantae, Protista, Animalia, and those are kind of outdated terms now, but this was one of the first models of kind of trying to categorize the diversity of life. And then on the right, this is an expanded kind of RNA-based tree of life that was made in 2016. So each one of those skinny little lines is representing an individual organism, and this was focusing on bacteria and archaea. So you can see down here, This might be kind of hard to see with this text color, but down here, these would be eukaryotic organisms, and then everything else represented on this tree would be bacteria and archaea. So this is just kind of getting a glimpse at what all the living organisms are. There's a ton of diversity on the planet. Now, moving into the idea of how we define something to be alive. When I put this picture up here, we have our tarantula. Tarantula sitting on a rock. You might also notice the toad here. This is a narrow-mouthed toad, and they do occasionally live in burrows with tarantulas in an interesting relationship. But we recognize the toad and the tarantula as alive, and we inherently know the rock is not alive, right? Like you all would obviously know that, of course. But what is it that allows us to make this kind of assumption? Is it life experience? Is it things we've learned over time? Maybe both. When you kind of break down this rock tarantula idea a little bit further, we can see Little Jerusalem over here, these limestone bluffs, and they are made of minerals. They're calcite and dolomite, which are the molecules I have abbreviated up here. We have our tarantula at the bottom, again, our living organism, and that is represented by the carbohydrate generic formula. That's what that CxH2O situation is. And then nucleic acids. So these two different things are made up of sort of similar components. We're noticing carbons, we're noticing oxygens. We're seeing they both have molecules, but again, one is alive and one is not. So molecules alone are not alive. The properties of life only appear once they begin to be organized in the cell. So the cell is our smallest unit of life. And this image here is representing an animal cell. And I've kind of zoomed in and made this figure to show the different molecules of life, which we'll be talking about. So again, just to reiterate, the cell is our smallest unit of life. And this is when biologists kind of start to classify something as being alive if it is made of cells. So the properties of life that are used to define it do not really appear until we see cellular organization. There are some unifying characteristics that we're going to be talking about, and I will go over each one of these in some amount of detail today. There's about 7. This is kind of an important caveat, though. Depending on the textbook you read and when it was published, if you happen to pick up a textbook and read it, you might notice that these are defined a little bit differently. Some people say there's 8, some people say there's 7, and the way that they describe these characteristics vary a little bit. But overall, these are going to be our main characteristics of life as broadly recognized by most biologists. So these are the specific components that help us define living things. We're going to start by talking about order. This is basically the fact that complex organisms have structure, they have hierarchical characteristics, and they tend to be structured in specific ways. Life is characterized by order. Now, there's a lot of text I'm going to pop up on here pretty quickly, frankly. This is an example of organization within like a human body, for example. So we're starting with this basic unit of organization, atoms. We're going to talk about atoms in a couple of days when we talk about the chemistry that is important to know for biology. But we see again here, atoms lead into molecules, molecules, organelles, and then we get to that basic membrane-bound unit of life. We get to our cells. Cells make tissues, tissues make organs, and then most animals are comprised of a combination of organ systems with tissues and things. So this is an example of highly organized, ordered structures. And this figure to the right is clipped from your textbook, and that's just kind of the same example, but I wrote out the words for you so you could read them. We can also talk about organisms within a broader context of even kind of more widely encompassing biological organization, things like populations, communities, ecosystems, and biomes, biospheres. This figure is kind of cutesy, but it's showing that idea in kind of a simplified way. We can see the organism would be part of a population. Population might be part of a community, which would be all living organisms in an area. The community would be in an ecosystem, which encompasses the organisms as well as the plants and animals, living and non-living things, biomes, and then the biosphere would be every living thing on the planet or the entire globe. So lots of order here. If you're noticing, I have the little star on the cell. That's because that's our first identification point for life. Next up is response or stimuli to the environment. So this is an important characteristic of life, and different types of organisms are going to respond in different ways to an outside stimulus. Now, we could have a positive or a negative response, and we would kind of refer to that as something moving like towards or away, towards or away from something. Now up here, I have maybe some recognizable things. What about on the bottom? You all know that one, probably. Turtle. Yeah, box turtle. Yes, a lovely ornate box turtle. What about the other things on there? What are they? Do you know? This one you could use like a generic term. Flower, plant. Yeah, this is a plant, right? Any thoughts on this one? Kind of hairy looking thing. It's a bacteria. Yep. So what are some of the ways that these types of organisms might move or respond towards stimulus? Starting with the turtle. How might it respond to stimulus? What might it be doing? Yeah, maybe it's going to run from the road. Maybe it'll move away from predators. We might also think about it moving towards a food source. Maybe it's foraging, right? Plants, if you've ever grown like a pea plant or a cucumber, you know how they have tendrils that grow up things and they move towards the sunlight. If you grow a house plant, its leaves will turn towards the window. We know that plants will respond to stimulus in classic ways. Other plants have other capacities to respond to stimulus as well, based on what types of plants they're. And bacteria have the ability to detect certain chemicals or molecules in their media or in their environment, and then they can move towards or away from those as well. So kind of answering that question here, how these organisms might differ in their response. Other things plants might do would be growing roots. That would be a really important one I forgot to mention. They might be growing towards like water or nutrients in the soil. So this video, hopefully I can get to play. This is a really cool example of something called thigmonastic movement, which is where a plant or a fungus can respond to touch or vibration. So let me see if I can hopefully get this for you. You don't really need the sound. She's just blabbing about this plant. So you see when you touch this specific plant, which is usually like a briar is what they're usually called, or a mimosa pudica plant, you touch them and their leaves actually close, which is kind of a unique response to stimulus. Venus flytraps also exhibit this type of thigmonastic movement when they close on prey items. And these types of plants actually occur in Kansas, so you can see these if you've ever been to like Wilson Lake. They have some out there. I think we honestly have them around Hayes as well. So the sensitive briar plant is a pretty fun example of that idea. I have a little bit of a break for you. I want you to reflect from last class with a partner. I want you to answer these questions. Do you use AI a lot? What is the biggest risk of AI? And what is the biggest potential future benefit? So chat with a partner about this before we keep going.
Yeah.
Does anyone want to share their thoughts here? Sure, yeah.
The biggest risk is that we lose our creativity.
Mm.
Much to generate ideas for ourselves.
Yeah, like using it to brainstorm ideas, then like maybe we would lose the capacity to make those ideas. Yeah, that's a good idea. That's a good thought. Uh-huh. Losing our creativity. Does anyone else have any ideas here? We'll keep moving. If you want to share with me, I am truly curious about this, so feel free to grab me at any time. Let me know what you think. Next up for characteristics of life is reproduction. Both single-celled organisms and complex organisms are going to be reproducing. The way that they do that varies pretty widely. They might just be duplicating their DNA, which is what we see with bacteria. They're just going to copy their single piece of DNA and then make offspring that are genetically identical to themselves. Other organisms like humans and most animals tend to make reproductive cells, and then we see sexual reproduction, which has various benefits. I was kind of just talking about these two different reproductive pathways. So our sexual reproduction and then asexual reproduction. There are benefits to both based on the type of organism and the environment that you're in. So asexual reproduction, you do not need a second organism. So this can be beneficial if you're the type of organism that's living in a really isolated area. Sometimes reproduction can cause conflict. You might be at risk of dying or losing your life in the animal kingdom. So there can be benefits there for asexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction tends to use more resources. So we can see a variety of kind of ideas here. And I'll talk more about these as we kind of move forward in the semester. Mostly we'll be talking about sexual reproduction with meiosis, which is what happens in humans and lots of other complex organisms. But a key piece to sexual reproduction is the combination of two parental gametes. So we get genetic diversity as a result of that process, which is super important for evolutionary potential and for the continuance of species, honestly. Now, the examples I have up here, of course, we have a frog example. This is two frogs in amplexus, which is the typical grasping mating position of those types of creatures. Usually the female is larger and the male would be on top in these types of amplexus positions. In the bottom, this is a banana plant, and this is showing asexual reproduction with vegetative cloning, essentially. So the little plant growing next to the bigger stem or the bigger stalk would be what we would call like a pup or a sucker, and that would be genetically identical to that parent plant. So if you dug up all the soil underneath here, you would probably see those two plants are connected underneath the ground. Questions here? As promised, my little aside on bananas. They do reproduce vegetatively, which is kind of interesting when we think about how that might potentially impact humans. It's likely that all the bananas you've ever eaten in your life are the same variety and had pretty much the same genetic variant of what we call the Cavendish banana. There's very little genetic variation in this species or in this cultivar because it reproduces vegetatively, and we've done a lot of selective breeding to get rid of the things that are unpalatable about natural or native bananas. These pictures that are of the pink banana and then this yellow wild banana, these black circles are seeds and they're hard like glass marbles. If you like chew on them, they're very not delicious. And then the flesh of the fruit is not super sweet the way we would imagine a typical banana to be like. So over time, we've kind of bred bananas to lose those characteristics. And historically, folks did rely on eating native bananas, but mostly they ate like the leaves and the roots and the shoots, the stems, all the other pieces. So bananas are really interesting to kind of talk about for a lot of different reasons. So if you want to chat about bananas, if you want to read about bananas, let me know. They're kind of weird. Our next characteristic of life is adaptation or evolution. I have a definition up here for you. That's what this first bullet is. These are characteristics that help an organism reproduce more under certain environmental conditions. We're going to spend 2 or 3 days talking about evolution and the specifics of this type of process. The most common kind of type of evolution that we tend to see, or the most common mechanism that's observed, is natural selection. So natural selection is the mechanism and evolution is the change over time. We know that these adaptations or characteristics that help an organism survive and reproduce are not set. They can change over time and they vary based on the environmental conditions. Maybe if it's super warm for 200 years and that causes the ground to be more brown, the certain characteristic might be better to be brown. If it suddenly turns into an ice age and there's snow on the ground, it might be less advantageous to be brown, and we would see maybe a different fur color or hair color kind of evolve over time. So that's the idea behind adaptations not being set. They can change based on what types of advantages are available. This natural selection process dictates which traits persist under changing conditions. So again, we'll talk more about natural selection. Now, the picture I have up here is something that I think is a really cool example of evolution. This is the pygmy seahorse. So hopefully you can see this little dude up here. This is a seahorse. And then the coral, this is a Gregorian coral, is all around the seahorse. Now, the person who discovered this did so in like 1987, so it honestly wasn't very long ago. And they weren't trying to study seahorses. They were a coral researcher. They were studying the Gregorian corals, and then they accidentally found pygmy seahorses because they were so well camouflaged. So that's how we originally described this species. They're about an inch big, so they're really tiny, and they live in Southeast Asia. So this is an excellent example of this type of adaptive evolution over time. I have a kind of, maybe it's not a question, but kind of a challenging question if I was to ask you one. Consider sexual versus asexual reproducing species relative to evolution. I'm just going to kind of tell you about this a little bit. We were just talking, sexual reproduction confers genetic variability, right? And genetic variability is the raw material for evolution. So we would expect to see potentially greater rates of evolution in sexually reproducing species. That said, asexually reproducing species do still have evolution. They do still go through evolution, and they can acquire adaptations over time. Typically, that occurs via mutations or other types of processes where they can pick up DNA from their environment. So more on that later. Questions here? Okay. Next up, growth and development. All living organisms have some amount of expansion, development, growth period. Maybe it's a change. Typically, inherited information is what's going to dictate how organisms grow and develop. So the genetic material that an organism has is going to predict the changes it will go through. Now, this figure here is showing the metamorphosis of a butterfly. Now, you've probably seen this, maybe even like observed this when you're in elementary school. Butterflies go through a full metamorphosis. They start as an egg, which isn't shown here, and then they turn into a caterpillar. The caterpillar eats a lot of food and then eventually builds a chrysalis. What's crazy about butterflies and chrysalises is they actually liquefy. So the caterpillar's body turns into liquid, and then the proteins and different kind of goo reforms into the butterfly. And there's things called imaginal discs that kind of help that organism go into the way that it's supposed to. Kind of crazy. So sometimes when butterflies hatch from a chrysalis or they come out of a chrysalis, there will be like drippings, and that might be a residue from that liquefaction. So butterflies are crazy. Lots of other organisms go through metamorphosis. Things like amphibians, frogs, salamanders, things like that. You don't have to go through metamorphosis to be considered alive. Some organisms just have life cycles. Of course, if we think about humans, you grow from like a baby to an adult. That would be part of this as well. I mentioned amphibians because they're interesting examples. They're reliant on fresh water for their breeding. Typically egg masses, which you can see is that kind of jelly blob on the right side of the screen. Those are laid in water. And the larval form of most salamanders actually have gills that are external, and they swim around. If you've ever seen an axolotl, that is kind of what larval salamanders look like. Now, some species have actually evolved to retain those juvenile characteristics, which is what we call pedomorphic characteristics or a pedomorphic organism. And that's what these red arrows are showing. In certain conditions, some salamanders can stay in their juvenile form, but be sexually reproductive or sexually mature based on environmental characteristics, whereas others, depending on the conditions, if there's lots of water or not very much water, it might go into that terrestrial adult stage, which is what we're seeing up at the top here. So another cool example of this kind of development metamorphosis over time. Now, this figure is specifically looking at mole salamanders, which we don't have in Kansas, but tiger salamanders we have here, and they also have the gills. So kind of cool. Organisms work to keep their internal conditions within a specific set, and it's usually fairly specific. This is our regulation process. Most of the time, when I say organisms are working to keep their internal conditions, I'm talking about like temperature and pH. If there's large fluctuations in those, body systems can shut down, enzymes won't work properly, proteins won't be able to be produced effectively, cellular respiration can be inhibited. There's all kinds of problems if you have serious changes to some of that external or internal environment. So that is why organisms are generally able to respond to that, because it can be lethal if they do not. Different organisms have the ability to detect environmental changes and then compensate for them. So if it's really hot and you're a snake, snakes can't maintain their body temperatures. They have to just get to where it's shady. Whereas humans, if we're really hot and we're in the sun, we start to sweat. We can kind of maintain our own body temperatures a little bit better. Within reason, I mean, you would eventually dehydrate and not be able to continue to cool yourself, but there's various processes here. Typically, organisms are working to maintain homeostasis, which is the steady internal state that organisms maintain. You might have heard this word before. I have a couple of different examples up here for you. I'm going to start at the bottom. Does anyone know what that is? It lives in this. Yeah, the fox, It's a fennec fox. Yeah, absolutely. They live in the Sahara Desert, so a super hot place, and a couple of adaptations that they have to kind of regulate their temperature. They have their feet or their pads covered in fur, which helps protect them from hot sand. If you've ever been on the beach or like the lake in the summer, you know how hot sand can get. They also have really large ears relative to their body size, which help them radiate heat and maintain their internal temperature as well. They're also nocturnal, so mostly they forage at night. I honestly don't know what's up with this fox in this picture. They're usually not out during the day. And that is another adaptation they have to kind of regulate their environment. The other two things I have up here is a canyon tree frog, which is that top figure. The frog is kind of tucked into a rock face. You can see it's in something we would call a water conservation posture, which is where it's reducing the amount of possible respiration or possible transpiration, which would be losing water from its skin. Amphibians are very susceptible to dehydrating or desiccating is what we'd call that. So they can kind of move their bodies in and out of positions to adjust for that. Other frogs, the coqui frog is the one in the middle. They can close and open their eyes, and that actually also helps regulate their moisture and temperature. And this frog would probably be calling for mates, and calling for mates also is something that would affect your regulation. So they might make different behavioral adaptations as well. Questions here? Cool. So all organisms need energy for their metabolic activities. Therefore, all living things are going to have energy processing. Now, when I say metabolic activities, I'm referring to processes that convert energy from one form to another. So that conversion process of energy is what we refer to as metabolism. If you eat some food when you're hungry and then that food makes you feel less hungry and then you're more energized, that's a perfect example of like metabolism in action. Now, the importance of this honestly can't be overstated. This is how all cells get energy to keep doing all their functions which run living organisms. We do have entire units dedicated, and by units I mean lecture periods, dedicated to photosynthesis and cellular respiration, which are super important metabolic processes you might have talked about or heard about before. Now up here, this is like a challenge question. Does anyone know what that molecule is? Do you have any guesses? I'd be really surprised if you knew. So if you don't know, it's okay. It's the energy currency of the cell. It is. Yep, that's ATP up there. So we're going to talk about that super important molecule. Yep, so we have ATP up there, and then the bottom figure is just photosynthesis, or a diagram of the inputs and outputs of photosynthesis. Questions here? Cool. That is all I have for you today. I told you it's kind of a chill lecture. On Monday, we'll be talking about principal features of science, peer-reviewed literature, etc. So have a great weekend, and I'll be in my office if you have questions.